Hello, welcome to the Historian channel. Right on the channel, leave your like, gratitude, then let's go. September 1926. The sound of gunfire echoes in the street outside the headquarters of the Southside Gang in Cicero, Illinois. Machine guns blaze relentlessly, and the hawkhorn is struck by over 1,000 bullets. The target was the infamous gangster Al Capone. Yet, the crime boss escapes once again. Whether through luck, security measures, or insider information, Capone seems invincible, at least for now. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, the beginning. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, known in history as Al Capone, was born on 17 January 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, United States. His father, Gabriel Capone, was a barber who emigrated from Hungary, a small village near Naples in southern Italy, along with his wife, Teresa Capone, born Teresa Raiola. Teresa was a seamstress and had 9 children with Gabriel. The couple arrived in Brooklyn in 1893, after emigrating through the port of Rijeka, in what was then Austria-Hungary, modern-day Croatia. Initially, they lived at 95 Navy Street in the Navy Yard area of downtown Brooklyn. Later, they moved to Park Slope, also in Brooklyn, when Alphonse was 11 years old. Alphonse had 8 siblings. Vincenzo, who became a prohibition agent under the pseudonym Richard Hart. Raphael James, Bottles, who took over his brother's liquor empire. Salvatore, Frank, who also worked for Al. Amina, who died at the age of 1. John, Amino, as well as Albert, Matthew, and their surviving sister, Mafalda. Education and early steps into crime. When Alphonse started school, he showed promise as a student, bringing home excellent grades that made his parents proud. However, he struggled to follow the strict rules of his Catholic upbringing. At the age of 14, he was expelled from school for hitting a teacher. After this incident, his formal education ended, but his schooling in the criminal world was just beginning. Surrounded by criminal influences, which seemed to be a normal part of life in Brooklyn, Al began associating with local gangs. He first joined the Bowery Boys and the Junior 40 Thieves. Later, he became part of the Brooklyn Rippers and eventually joined the notorious 5 Points Gang, the most powerful gang of the time, based in Lower Manhattan. Rising in the criminal underworld. In 1917, Al Capone began working for Frankie Yale, a bootlegger and racketeer who demanded payments from local businesses in exchange for protection. Using the profits from this operation, Frankie opened the Harvard Inn, a bar in Coney Island. Al was hired as a bartender and doorman, but during this time, he also absorbed knowledge and learned the intricacies of the criminal underworld. Capone was further influenced by other notorious figures, such as gangster Johnny Torrio, whom he admired and considered a mentor. It was during this period that Al Capone began his journey to becoming one of the most feared and legendary figures in the history of organized crime. The infamous Scar and Al Capone's early years. It was during his time working as a doorman at the Harvard Inn that Al Capone earned the nickname he despised, Scarface. The incident occurred after he got into a fight with a local gangster, Frankie Galaccio. Capone had unwittingly insulted Galaccio's vibrant and beautiful sister, Lena, by making an inappropriate comment about her posterior. The drunken altercation escalated, and Galaccio slashed Capone with a knife, leaving a permanent scar on the left side of his face. Capone was deeply self-conscious about the scar and took measures to hide it. He often posed for photographs with his unscarred side facing the camera. He even fabricated a story, claiming the scar was a war wound from a German gunner in the trenches of World War I, although this was false, as he had never served in the war. Despite disliking Scarface, Capone was fond of another nickname given to him by his close friends, Smokey, a term used for a sharp dresser. He was also known by other monikers, including Big Al, Big Boy, and later, Public Enemy Number 1. Reconciliation with Frankie Galaccio. After the altercation with Galaccio, Capone initially sought revenge. However, senior gangsters in the community insisted on reconciliation. Galaccio apologized for causing the scar, and Capone, respecting the unwritten code of gangland loyalty, promised not to retaliate. He kept this promise even after becoming a mob boss. Capone's willingness to reconcile stemmed from his understanding of the situation. He acknowledged that his own behavior had provoked the incident and recognized that Galaccio was simply protecting his family. This principle of family loyalty and respect was central to the operations of Italian-American gangsters at the time. Despite living outside the law, these figures adhered to a personal moral code, where family was paramount. Marriage and family life. Family held deep importance for Capone. When his girlfriend, May Josephine Coughlin, gave birth to their son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone, in December 1918, there was no question about their next step. They married a few weeks later, on 30th December. May, an Irish Catholic, had been working in a local department store when she met Capone. At the time of their marriage, Capone was only 19 years old, while May was 21. Being underage, Capone had to secure written consent from his parents to marry. Their marriage was a happy one and lasted until the end of Capone's life. A move to Chicago. Shortly after marrying May, Capone received an offer from his mentor, Johnny Torrio, to move to Chicago. Eager for a fresh start and a chance to build a better life for his family, Capone agreed. In 1919, he left Brooklyn and headed to the Windy City, where his infamous criminal empire would eventually take shape. Al Capone, the brothel, syphilis, and Prohibition's rise. While working as a bouncer in a brothel, Al Capone contracted syphilis. In hindsight, the disease might have been cured with timely treatment using salvarsan, a newly introduced drug. However, Capone seemingly never sought treatment until it was too late. The surge of organized crime across the United States during the 1920s can largely be attributed to the persistent nationwide demand for alcohol, despite its prohibition under the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1919. This amendment, along with the Volstead Act, effectively outlawed the production, sale, and distribution of most alcoholic beverages. The roots of prohibition. Calls for banning alcohol had been growing in the United States since the 1800s, particularly among puritanical Protestant Christians. These groups became increasingly vocal and militant in their campaigns against liquor sales. A notable figure in the temperance movement was Carrie Nation, who gained fame in 1900 for her divinely inspired rampage across Kansas, during which she smashed up bars and saloons using rocks and hatchets, claiming she acted on God's orders. Many women supported prohibition, often due to personal experiences of suffering at the hands of drunken husbands. Over time, their advocacy gained momentum, eventually pressuring 46 states to ratify the 18th Amendment. By the early 1920s, the sale and consumption of most alcoholic beverages were illegal in the US. The birth of a black market. Despite prohibition, many Americans, especially those of Italian and Irish heritage, had no intention of giving up alcohol. A vast black market quickly emerged, creating lucrative opportunities for organized crime. Criminal enterprises flourished, smuggling and distributing alcohol across the country in defiance of the law. This illicit trade greatly benefited the underworld, which made fortunes supplying liquor to eager consumers. The industry's success was bolstered by widespread corruption, with politicians and law enforcement officials accepting bribes to turn a blind eye. Capone's Chicago years. In 1923, Capone purchased a modest house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in Park Manor, on Chicago's South Side, for $5,500. To the outside world, he was a boxing promoter. In reality, Capone was deeply involved in organized crime, working under Johnny Torrio, who had taken over leadership of the Chicago outfit from James "Big Jim" Colosimo. During the height of Prohibition, the Chicago outfit, also known as the South Side Gang, became a powerful organization. It operated illegal stills and breweries, established a transportation network extending into Canada, and protected its operations through bribery of politicians and law enforcement. The organization also used fear to expand its influence. Businesses that refused to buy illicit liquor often faced violent consequences, including bombings. By this time, the outfit had become a dominant force in Chicago, cementing its role as a central player in America's Prohibition-era underworld. Al Capone, the high life and political manipulation. During the 1920s bombings associated with organized crime claimed as many as 100 lives. Amid this violence, Al Capone embraced the high life. He wore expensive bespoke suits, smoked cigars, dined on the finest foods, and surrounded himself with glamorous female companions. Capone was also known for his ostentatious taste in jewelry. He enjoyed public attention, reveling in moments like being cheered upon his arrival at ball games. He cultivated an image as a modern-day Robin Hood, making charitable donations from his immense illicit wealth. When questioned about his activities and extravagant lifestyle, Capone often deflected with disingenuous humility, famously stating, "I am just a businessman giving the people what they want," or, "All I do is satisfy a public demand." In many ways, he became a celebrity before the concept of celebrity culture truly existed. Political reform and relocation to Cicero. In 1923, Chicago saw a political shift with the appointment of reformist Mayor William Emmett Deva. Anticipating potential interference and investigations, Capone and his mentor, Johnny Torrio, relocated their operations to the nearby suburb of Cicero, Illinois. From this new base, Capone expanded the Southside Gang's empire. They established illegal brothels, speakeasies, gambling dens, and a robust liquor supply network to service all of Cicero's saloons. Capone used bribery and intimidation to dominate local elections, including the 1924 Cicero municipal elections. This strategic move not only shielded him from rival gangs like the North Side Gang, but also from reformist politicians who threatened his operations. The 1924 Cicero elections, corruption and violence. At the time, Cicero's mayor, Joseph Z. Klenha, a corrupt Republican, had been in office for 3 consecutive terms with minimal opposition. His administration, supported by Capone's Southside Gang, had maintained control over the town. Capone's brother, Salvatore Frank Capone, played a key role in consolidating this power. However, in 1924, the Democratic Party launched a serious challenge, pledging to clean up the town. The election was set for 1st April 1924, and Klenha sought Capone's assistance to secure victory. In exchange for granting the Chicago outfit effective immunity from prosecution in Cicero, Capone mobilized his forces. Capone enlisted 200 men, including members of his gang and allied groups. Among them were his brothers Frank and Ralph Capone, as well as his cousin Charles Fischetti. The gang initiated a campaign of violence, including stabbings, shootings, kidnappings, and widespread intimidation, to ensure Clenha's re-election. The violence began on 31st March, with the gang working ruthlessly to maintain their grip on Cicero's political landscape. Violence and intimidation on election day. On the eve of the election, the Democratic nominee for town clerk, William K. Palmer, was brutally attacked. He was beaten, his offices were ransacked, and his wife was thrown against a wall. The violence escalated on election day, 1st April, with voters facing threats at polling stations guarded by gangsters armed with submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns. Those who voted for the incumbent, Joseph Z. Clenha, were allowed to vote multiple times. However, voters who resisted intimidation were prevented from casting their ballots or subjected to beatings. Gangsters patrolled the streets in cars filled with armed men, targeting political opponents. The Democratic candidate for mayor, Rudolph Hurt, saw his campaign headquarters riddled with bullets, while the Democratic challenger for town clerk was pistol-whipped in front of his family and supporters. Frank Capone personally assaulted several campaign officials and trashed another opponent's office. Widespread intimidation and detainment. Polling stations were raided, ballots were stolen from voters, and some individuals were shot, stabbed, or beaten by gangsters, known as sluggers, roaming the streets. One campaign official, Joseph Price, was tied up, gagged, and savagely beaten. Another Democratic official, Stanley Stienkovich, was blindfolded and held in a Chicago basement until the polls had closed. As part of their efforts to suppress votes, up to 20 individuals were chained to posts and pipes in the basement of a plumbing store. A police officer who intervened was disarmed and beaten. Michael Gavin, a Democratic campaigner, was shot in both legs and confined with 8 other campaign workers in the basement of a mob-controlled Chicago hotel to prevent them from participating in the election. The police response. The chaos prompted a desperate call for help to Cook County Judge Edmund K. Jarecki. In response, he dispatched 70 Chicago police officers, organized into 5 detective squads and 9 police squads in vehicles, to restore order in Cicero. During their deployment, one squad car carrying uniformed officers and detectives spotted Al Capone, his brother Frank Capone, and their associates Dove Headland and Charles Fischetti. The officers acted quickly, jumping out of their vehicle to confront the gangsters. What followed was a pivotal moment in the escalating violence surrounding the Cicero election, illustrating the extent of corruption and lawlessness in the era of Prohibition. The death of Frank Capone and its aftermath. As police confronted the gangsters, a gunfight broke out. Frank Capone was shot and killed, while Headland was wounded. Al Capone managed to escape, and Charles Fischetti later surrendered. In the wake of his brother's death, Al Capone arranged a lavish funeral, sparing no expense. The floral arrangements alone, supplied by local bootlegger and florist Dean O'Banion, cost $20,000. Mourners grieved loudly for Frank, lamenting the loss of someone so young. Among the attendees, observing discreetly from a distance, were the same police officers responsible for Frank's death. They appeared to be gauging Capone's reaction, but the mob boss maintained his composure, at least publicly, not retaliating during the funeral itself. Surviving the perils of power. As the head of the Cicero mob, Al Capone faced constant threats to his life from rival gangsters and the looming danger of arrest. Despite bribing and corrupting local politicians to shield himself, his position was precarious. Capone was exceptionally vigilant about his security, a necessity underscored by chilling events. For example, his driver was tortured and murdered, and Capone narrowly escaped an assassination attempt in the Chicago Loop, the city's business district. Capone's mentor, Johnny Torrio, had taken over from Big Jim Colosimo after Colosimo's murder on 11 May 1920, a killing many suspected Capone had orchestrated. In his new role, Torrio relied on Capone's street smarts and connections from New York to mediate gang disputes and broker treaties. Capone earned a reputation as an effective negotiator and peacekeeper in the chaotic criminal underworld, brokering deals and navigating treachery. One of Capone's most notable achievements was mediating territorial disputes between the North Side Gang, led by Dean O'Banion, and the Jenner brothers, who were allied with Torrio. However, tensions escalated when the Jenner brothers began undercutting O'Banion by selling cheap booze to his customers. Torrio appeared to turn a blind eye to the encroachment, further straining relations. The conflict reached its peak on 10 November 1924, when Dean O'Banion was assassinated in his flower shop, a legitimate front for his criminal operations. The murder was carried out by Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Yale and Jenner associates Albert Anselmi and John Scalise. O'Banion's killing was likely sanctioned by Torrio, solidifying his position while eliminating a volatile rival. Dean O'Banion was a peculiar figure in the criminal world, known for his wide grin, erratic behavior, and macabre sense of humor. He had a reputation for recklessness, including shooting a man in public without provocation and killing another at Capone's Four Deuces Club, drawing unwanted police attention to the gang. However, his most consequential act was deceiving Torrio into visiting one of his breweries shortly before a police raid, leading to Torrio's arrest. O'Banion's betrayal set in motion a series of retaliatory events that further destabilized Chicago's criminal landscape and ultimately cemented Capone's dominance in the city's underworld. The North Side Gang's revenge and the rise of Capone. Dean O'Banion's arrogance and boasting about his betrayal of Johnny Torrio ultimately sealed his fate. His assassination in November 1924 shifted the leadership of the North Side Gang to Jaime Weiss, supported by his second-in-command, Vincent Druxy, and Bugs Moran. O'Banion had been a close friend of Weiss, and the new leadership was singularly focused on avenging his death. Thus began a bloody 5-year gang war between the North Side and South Side factions. Ambushes and leadership changes. The violence escalated quickly. In January 1925, Al Capone narrowly escaped an ambush, emerging physically unharmed but visibly shaken. 12 days later, Johnny Torrio was ambushed and shot while returning from a shopping trip. The attack deeply affected Torrio, leading him to step down from leadership and hand control of the Chicago outfit to Capone, who was just 26 years old at the time. The North Side Gang's attempts to eliminate Capone didn't stop. On 20th September 1926, they staged a dramatic attack on Capone's headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn. Armed with Thompson submachine guns, the attackers fired over 1,000 rounds at the building in an effort to draw Capone to the window. Despite the intense assault, Capone emerged unscathed and, in response, called for a truce. Negotiations followed but ultimately failed to resolve the escalating conflict. Just weeks later, Jaime Weiss was assassinated by the South Side Gang outside what had been O'Banion's flower shop, now the North Side Gang's headquarters. Retaliation came swiftly. In January 1927, Bugs Moran and Vincent Druxy kidnapped and murdered the owner of Hawthorne's restaurant, a close friend of Capone. Capone's strategic escapes and luxurious lifestyle. The ongoing turf wars forced Capone to increase his security measures. To protect himself, he frequently left Chicago, taking extended trips with his entourage. It was not unusual for Capone to rent an entire Pullman sleeper car at the Chicago train station, traveling to places like Little Rock, Hot Springs, Kansas City, Omaha, or Cleveland. During these trips, he and his associates stayed in luxurious hotels, always booking under false names. In 1928, Capone made a more permanent move to secure his safety, purchasing a 14-room mansion at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island in Biscayne Bay, Miami, Florida. He reportedly paid $40,000 for the property to August Bush, a beer magnate from Missouri. True to his cautious nature, the house, like all his assets, was not registered in his name. Capone avoided owning property directly and even refrained from using a bank account, relying instead on Western Union for cash transactions. The public image of Al Capone. Despite his infamy, Capone cultivated an image of a benevolent benefactor. He made significant charitable contributions and even established a soup kitchen in Chicago during the Great Depression. These gestures endeared him to the public, who often saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood. Capone also leveraged political alliances to solidify his power. For instance, he supported William Hale Thompson, a corrupt Chicago mayor who turned a blind eye to Capone's criminal empire, ensuring that his operations remained largely unchallenged. While Capone's rise to power was marked by violence and corruption, his strategic thinking and careful cultivation of public goodwill allowed him to maintain control of Chicago's underworld for years. Capone's donation and the path to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In 1927, Al Capone made a generous donation of $250,000 to the Republican candidate for Chicago's mayoral election. The candidate had hinted during his campaign that he would support the reopening of illegal saloons, presenting a lucrative opportunity for Capone's thriving bootlegging business. With Capone's backing, William Hale Thompson defeated his reformist rival, William Emmett Deva, and became mayor. This victory solidified a mutually profitable relationship between Thompson and Capone, which would last until 1929. However, an event in 1929, later infamously known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, would shatter Capone's carefully maintained facade of legitimacy and jeopardize his informal immunity from police scrutiny, an arrangement that had been bolstered by his alliance with Thompson. Rivalry with Bugs Moran. Bugs Moran, now leader of the North Side Gang following the death of Jaime Weiss, was a persistent adversary and bitter enemy of Capone. Their animosity was fueled by both competition in bootlegging operations and personal disdain. Moran, a staunch Catholic, detested Capone's involvement in prostitution, which he viewed as immoral. The escalating cycle of violence and retaliatory killings between their gangs reached a bloody crescendo on 14 February 1929. The Street Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone orchestrated a plan to eliminate Moran. Renting an apartment across from Moran's headquarters, Capone's men monitored the movements of Moran's gang. On 13 February, Capone arranged for a call to Moran, offering a shipment of whiskey from Detroit at a bargain price. Moran agreed and requested delivery the next morning at 10:30 a.m. to the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street, where his bootlegging vehicles were stored. On 14 February, the supposed delivery arrived. Capone's men staged a fake police raid, with two gunmen disguised as plainclothes officers and two dressed as uniformed Chicago police. They lined up 7 of Moran's men against a wall, ostensibly for a search. Once positioned, the signal was given, and the men were ruthlessly gunned down with machine guns and shotguns. Moran, the primary target, evaded the attack, having slept in that morning and arrived late. The aftermath. The massacre had immediate and far-reaching consequences for Capone. Photographs of the slaughtered victims shocked the public, tarnishing Capone's image and earning him the infamous moniker, Public Enemy Number 1. The massacre also cast a shadow on his close association with Mayor Thompson, raising questions about the appropriateness of their ties. Emergency services were delayed in responding to the scene, as neighbors assumed the police were already present due to the uniformed men involved in the attack. By the time help arrived, 6 men were dead. The lone survivor, Frank Gassenberg, was transported to the hospital but succumbed to his injuries shortly after. The Street Valentine's Day Massacre marked a turning point in Capone's reign, exposing the brutal violence of gangland Chicago and setting the stage for increased public and law enforcement scrutiny of his operations. Capone was taken to the hospital, refusing to identify his killers to maintain the gangsters' code, but he later died from his injuries. Bugs Moran's reaction to the brutal attack was to break the gangsters' code himself and inform the police that it was Capone who had arranged the massacre. This led to a summons for Capone to appear in court to answer the charges. However, Capone denied all responsibility, claiming that he was too ill to attend. This happened twice, and eventually, the charges were dropped. It seemed that his tactics had worked. Al Capone was notorious for letting others do his dirty work, but one story persists suggesting that he did not always follow this approach. The story begins with a night of drinking and dining with several of Capone's men, including Scarface, Anselmi, and Ginter, three men whom Capone believed were conspiring against him with another gangster. According to the account, Capone himself beat the men about the head with a baseball bat before ordering his men to shoot them. While some historians have questioned the veracity of this story, it was reported in the newspapers at the time. One of Capone's associates claimed to have witnessed both the planning of the attack and the incident itself. In 1929, attempts to bring public enemy number one to justice were intensified. On 27 March 1929, FBI agents arrested Capone as he left a courtroom after testifying before a grand jury investigating violations of prohibition laws. The charge brought against him was the feigning of illness, which he had used as an excuse to avoid earlier prosecution. On 16 May 1929, Capone was arrested again, this time in Philadelphia, on a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. He was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 1 year in prison. On 8 August 1929, Capone was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where he remained until his release in March 1930. However, in April 1930, Capone was arrested once more on vagrancy charges while visiting Miami Beach. The governor had ordered his expulsion from the state. During the arrest, Capone claimed that the police had threatened his family with arrest and denied him food and water. He was then further charged with perjury for making these claims, but after a 3-day trial in July, he was found not guilty. In September, a court judge issued another warrant for Capone's arrest on vagrancy charges. This judge was running against Thompson in the Republican primary election and used the publicity from the case to gain votes. In February 1931, Capone faced another trial, this time on charges of contempt of court due to his illness claims. Judge James Herbert Wilkinson went so far as to question the validity of Capone's doctor's testimony, which assisted the prosecutor. As a result, Capone was sentenced to 6 months in prison. Capone remained free for the time being as he had appealed the decision. The law was exploring every possible avenue to bring him to justice when Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt realized there might be another way. She recognized that the luxurious lifestyles of mobsters were backed by substantial income, yet they never filed income tax returns. Mabel came up with the idea of prosecuting the gangsters for tax evasion, allowing them to be convicted without the difficult task of acquiring testimony regarding their illegal deeds and violent crimes. She first tried this approach in the case of United States Wheat Munley Sullivan, an illegal bootlegger. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. ruled that illegally earned income should be subject to income tax, and the Fifth Amendment plea to protect criminals from reporting illegal income was invalid. After this, the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, appointed Frank J. Wilson to investigate Capone's tax matters. Capone's lawyers, having been ordered by him to get his tax position in order, declared taxable income of $100,000 for each of the years 1928 and 1929. Since he had not paid tax on that amount, the declaration was effectively an admission of guilt. On 13 March 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion for the year 1924. On 5 June 1931, He was indicted by a federal grand jury on 22 counts of income tax evasion for the years 1925 to 1929. He was released on bail of $50,000. A week after this, Elliot Ness and his team became involved in the case. Their evidence contributed to Capone's indictment for 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, which outlined the prohibition laws. Elliot Ness, an American prohibition agent in Chicago, is one of the names most closely associated with Capone. Ness was the leader of his team of reliable, incorruptible law enforcement agents, known as the Untouchables. With a reputation as an unwavering upholder of the law, he was impervious to the bribes and intimidation tactics employed by the Chicago outfit to sway him. In many ways, Ness was the exact opposite of Capone. Ness joined the U.S. Treasury Department in 1926 and worked within the Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago. He was part of the team assigned to take down Al Capone by investigating his illegal bootlegging activities and gathering evidence of conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition, Volstead Act. Additionally, Ness instigated raids on Capone's illegal stills and breweries, destroying his supply chain and causing an estimated loss of $9 million in income for Capone. By the end of their investigations, much of the information gathered on Capone came through wiretaps on his phone lines. The operation, led by Elliot Ness, caused major financial disruptions to Capone's operation and helped collect evidence for the 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act that he would eventually be tried for. On 16 June 1931, Capone stood before Judge James Herbert Wilkinson, the same judge who had convicted Capone's brother Ralph for tax evasion in 1930 and sentenced him to 3 years in prison. This time, Al Capone pled guilty to income tax evasion and the 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act as part of a plea bargain. In exchange, he agreed to plead guilty and return for a sentence of 2.5 years. However, when it came time for sentencing, Judge Wilkinson refused to honor the plea bargain. On 30th July 1931, Capone's counsel retracted the guilty pleas, arguing that a lawyer could not confess on behalf of his client. They claimed the lawyers had admitted the income, not Capone. Judge Wilkinson overruled the objection, stating that any statement made to a government official was done at the person's own risk. Therefore, the letter to federal authorities admitting income could be admitted into evidence by Capone's lawyer. Subsequently, Capone was tried solely on the income tax evasion charges, which were deemed to take precedence over the Volstead Act violations. Capone's lawyers had only hours to prepare for trial, as they had relied on the judge accepting the plea bargain. They argued that all of Capone's income had been lost due to his gambling habit. However, this defense was weak, as gambling losses were only admissible as a deduction from gambling winnings. Moreover, Capone's expenses revealed that there was far more money available to him than they claimed. The extent of Capone's spending was outlined in court in great detail, and the charge was that he had evaded $215,000 in taxes on a gross income of $1,038,654 over a 5-year period. On 31st October 1931, Al Capone was convicted on 3 counts of income tax evasion, and a week later, his sentence was handed down: 11 years in federal prison, a fine of $50,000, plus $7,692 in court costs. Additionally, he was liable for $215,000 in back taxes, plus interest. However, the sentence for contempt of court would be served concurrently. In response, Capone hired a team of expert lawyers from Washington, who filed a writ of habeas corpus, which required Capone to be brought to court to investigate whether his detention was lawful. Their argument was based on a Supreme Court ruling that had stated tax evasion was not fraud, which could mean the statute of limitations for prosecuting some of Capone's tax evasion charges might have expired. However, The judge decided that the time Capone had spent in Miami should be deducted from the dates of the offenses, rendering the argument invalid. Consequently, the appeal for both the conviction and the sentence was denied. Following the failed appeal, Capone was sent to the Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary on 3 May 1932, at the age of 33. Elliot Ness, one of the federal agents involved in Capone's case, was among those who accompanied him from Cook County Jail to the penitentiary. This was the only time the two men were known to have met in person. When Capone arrived, he weighed 250 pounds. After a medical exam, he was diagnosed with syphilis, gonorrhea, and a perforated nasal septum due to excessive cocaine use. Additionally, he was suffering from withdrawal symptoms from his cocaine addiction. While in Atlanta, Capone was competent in his job of stitching soles onto shoes but was not well liked by fellow inmates. They viewed him as weak, unable to deal with the bullying from other prisoners, and receiving special treatment. This special treatment was largely due to the protection offered by his cellmate, Red Radensky, a seasoned criminal linked to the Southside Gang. Facing growing animosity from other inmates and concerned about his mental state, Capone's family and associates, including Radensky, feared he might have a breakdown. As a result, it was decided that Capone would be transferred to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, located off the coast of San Francisco. In August 1934, Capone's new address became Cell 181 at Alcatraz. On 23 June 1936, Capone was attacked in the laundry area by fellow inmate James "Critter" Lucas, who was serving a life sentence for bank robbery. Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of scissors stolen from the prison barber, but Capone's injuries were only superficial. In January 1947, Capone suffered a stroke from which he initially started to recover. However, he later contracted bronchopneumonia and, on 22 January, experienced cardiac arrest. On 25 January 1947, Al Capone died of heart failure caused by apoplexy. He passed away at his home, surrounded by loved ones. A private funeral was held in Chicago a week later, and he was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. 3 years later, in 1950, his remains, along with those of his father, Gabriel, and his brother, Salvatore, were exhumed and reinterred at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Although Capone's reign may have ended with his death, the Chicago outfit continued its widespread criminal activities, including loan sharking, gambling, prostitution, political corruption, extortion, and murder. While they didn't maintain the same level of organized crime in Chicago, the outfit remained the most violent and powerful criminal syndicate in the Midwest, with influence stretching as far as Florida and California. Even after his death, Al Capone's legend lived on. His image and characterization have come to exemplify the American gangster, and he remains an iconic figure, with his portrayal appearing in films and publications to this day. What do you think of Al Capone? Was he a modern-day Robin Hood, giving the people a taste of what they wanted, or was he a tax dodger, cold-blooded killer, and gangster extraordinaire whose appetite for the high life eventually led to his downfall? Please let us know in the comments section. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Write yourself on the channel, leave your like, gratitude.